the most powerful sorcerer in creation of the gods, the old man who hands out godhood itself, was a real person. And for most of his long life, he was a complete and total failure. By almost every tradition we have, he lost at every trade he ever tried. And in the end, even his own wife walked out on him. You are meeting him right now, at the top of the world, in the biggest fantasy spectacle Chinese cinema has ever attempted. A white-bearded figure, standing beneath a vast scroll of names, reading them out one by one, and calling the dead and the worthy to take their places as the gods of heaven and earth and wind and water. The final chapter of that trilogy arrived in cinemas around the world for the Lunar New Year. And on screen, he is a master of spells and spirits, the one chosen by heaven to seal the gods to their thrones. But the strangest thing about him is not that legend turned him into a god. It is that the legend grew out of a man who was nobody at all. As an old man with nothing left, the stories say he went down to the bank of a wide river called the Wei, and he sat and he fished. But he fished in a way that made people stop and laugh, because the line he lowered toward the current had no hook on it at all, and he held it 3 feet above the water, where no fish could ever reach it. When they asked him what he was doing, he told them he was not fishing for fish. His name, the one that history would keep, was Jiang Ziya. He was also called Liu Shang, and later by a title that means the hope of the Grand Duke, Taigong Wang. And the old man with the empty line was simply waiting for a king. Within a few years, that forgotten failure would be the chief strategist of a small Western people called the Zhou, and he would help them bring down the oldest and greatest power in the world, a dynasty 600 years old, in the space of a single morning. He would lay the foundation of a civilization that outlived him by centuries, and he would be remembered so widely and for so long that in the end, the remembering turned him into a god. So this is not the story of the sorcerer who hands out godhood. It is that story told backwards, the question of how a poor old man, fishing with no hook for something no one else can see, became the man that the whole of China would one day place at the very top of heaven. To find him, we have to climb down from the high throne of the legend, all the way back to the rock by the river, and to a world that was already dying. To understand the old man on the rock, you have to understand the world he was waiting to change. And that world belonged to the Shang. For something like 600 years, the Shang had ruled the great plain of the Yellow River, a magnificent and frightening Bronze Age power, whose king stood as the one bridge between heaven and the living, and who kept that bridge with blood, sacrificing captives and servants in great numbers to honor the dead and feed the spirits. By the time our story begins, the throne belonged to the last of those kings, a ruler remembered as Di Xin. We should be careful with what comes next, because almost everything we are told about him comes from the people who destroyed him, and from storytellers who came many centuries later, and made him the blackest villain in all of Chinese memory. They say he was clever and strong and cruel, that he built a lake of wine and a forest of hung meat for his pleasure, that he invented dreadful punishments, and that he fell under the spell of a beautiful and merciless consort, whose name has become the most famous symbol of a ruined dynasty in all of China. That consort has her own story for another time, and it too is a portrait the winners had every reason to paint. What we can say more safely is simpler. The Shang court had grown cruel and isolated. It had turned its best men into enemies, and far to the west, a different kind of power was quietly rising. These were the Zhou, a smaller and rougher people who lived out toward the frontier in the valley of the Wei River, the Western people whose name would one day become the name of a dynasty. They were led by a man the histories call King Wen, the cultured king, respected as wise and just and patient, a builder of loyalty rather than terror. The last Shang king was right to fear him, because the Zhou were quietly gathering to themselves all the lords who had grown sick of the capital. And somewhere in that rising western land, beside that same Wei River, the failure with the hookless line had all but given up on the world. In the very season when the world was about to come looking for him, in the shape of a king walking down to the water. The meeting of the old man and the king is one of the most beloved scenes in all of Chinese tradition. And like most beloved scenes, it has been polished by 3,000 years of retelling, so we should hold it lightly. The story goes that King Wen, before setting out to hunt, had his diviners read the omens, and the omens told him something strange. He would take on that day neither bear nor tiger nor any beast of the field, but a helper sent to make him the founder of a dynasty, a teacher of kings. And so when the king came down to the northern bank of the Wei and found a white-haired old man fishing there with a line that held no hook, he did not laugh as the others had laughed. He stopped, and he spoke with him, and in that long conversation he heard the thing he had been looking for all his life. He heard a mind that understood not just war, but the whole art of winning, how to govern so that people came to you willingly, how to weaken an enemy long before you ever met him in the field, and how to wait for the single moment when one push would topple what had looked unshakable. The king is said to have told the old man that his own grandfather, the old duke, had once foreseen that a great sage would come to raise the house of Zhou, and that he, King Wen, had been hoping for that man ever since. And so he gave the old fisherman the name the histories would keep, Taigong, the hope of the Grand Duke, and he took him home not as a servant, but as his teacher and the commander of his armies. The hookless line made sense at last. The old man had not been wasting his years by the river. He had been refusing every small catch while he waited for the only one that would ever matter, and now, impossibly, it had come to him. Under his guidance, the Zhou grew stronger and more disciplined and more admired, drawing lords away from the dying Shang without a single battle, exactly as he taught. Much of that teaching, the patient art of taking a kingdom without ever fighting for it, was gathered long afterward into a famous book of strategy that still carries his name, the Six Secret Teachings, though the version we have was almost certainly written down many centuries after he died. What is certain is that the doctrine bore his fingerprints, the deep conviction that the greatest victories are the ones you arrange so carefully that the fighting becomes almost an afterthought. But King Wen would not live to see the reckoning. He died with the work half done, and the cause and the old teacher who carried it now passed into the hands of his son, who would have to decide for himself when the long waiting should finally end. The son was called King Wu, which means the martial king, and he inherited his father's ambition and his father's strategist together. But the old man had taught patience above every other virtue, and patience now faced its hardest test. By the traditional account, King Wu led his army east to a ford on the Yellow River called Mungjin, in what was meant to be a great show of strength. And when he arrived, something astonishing happened. Lords came to join him from every direction, unbidden and unsummoned, until the histories claim that 800 of them stood gathered at the river, all of them begging the young king to lead them against the hated Shang at once. The moment looked perfect. The enemy was hated, the allies were eager, the army was enormous, and the old strategist told the king to turn around and go home. The time he judged was not yet ripe. The mandate of heaven had not yet fully passed. The Shang king still held just enough strength and just enough fear in the land, and an attack now would be a gamble rather than a certainty. To the 800 lords, it must have looked like madness, but King Wu trusted his teacher, and the whole vast host turned around and marched back the way it had come. It is one of the hardest things in the world to walk away from a moment that everyone around you swears is the right one. And the old man had built his entire life on the ability to do exactly that. The films would later hand him spells and spirits to command a moment like this one. But the real power he showed at the river was rarer and harder. the plain nerve to walk away from a victory that was not yet ripe. Then he waited for the Shang to destroy itself, and it obliged him. In the years that followed, the last Shang king turned upon his own household. By tradition, he put to death the most loyal of his own kinsmen, the uncle who would not stop warning him to his face, and he imprisoned another and drove a third into exile, until the court that should have defended the throne had been gutted by the very man who sat upon it. The giant that had been too strong to strike was now hollow, rotten at the center, abandoned by its best and bravest men. And at last, the old strategist judged that the moment he had waited for, perhaps for the whole of his long life, had finally arrived. King Wu raised the host once more and brought it back down to the Yellow River, and this time, when the old man gave the word, the army did not turn back. It crossed the cold water in the dead of winter and marched straight on the Shang capital. Everything that Zhou had built, and everything the old fisherman had ever waited for, would now be settled in one battle outside the walls of the doomed Shang capital. The two armies met on a plain called Muye, within sight of the smoke of the Shang capital, more than 3,000 years ago. By the standard reckoning that historians use today, the year was around 1046 before the Common Era, though that date is a careful modern estimate and not a thing the ancients ever wrote down. What the old records do insist on is that the two sides were terribly unequal. The Zhou had marched in with a force built around war chariots and hardened, motivated men, while the Shang king, caught off his guard, threw together an enormous host by the desperate measure of arming whatever bodies he could find, including, the histories say, great numbers of slaves and prisoners of war. The traditional numbers given for that Shang army run into the hundreds of thousands, and we should not believe them. But every account agrees that the king's side was far larger, and that on paper, the morning should have belonged to the Shang. It did not, and the reason is the oldest lesson in the old strategist's art. An army is only ever as strong as its will to fight, and the men the Shang king had dragged onto that field had no reason in the world to die for him. According to tradition, Jiang Ziya himself rode out at the head of a picked vanguard, a man long past the age when most men can even sit a horse, and he beat the war drums and threw the first company straight at the Shang line to show that the giant could be made to bleed. This was the same forgotten failure the world would one day worship as a god. And when the Zhou struck, the great Shang host did the one thing its king had never imagined. The slaves and the conscripts in the front ranks turned their weapons around, and instead of defending the man who had enslaved them, they opened the road for the army that promised to end him. The huge formation collapsed inward upon itself, and what had begun as a battle became a rout and then a slaughter. So much blood was said to have been spilled that a later record claimed it floated the wooden pestles of the army downstream. And even in ancient times, honest readers found that far too much to swallow, and said it would be better not to believe every word the old books tell us. The last Shang king fled back through the gates of his burning capital, climbed a high terrace heaped with his treasures, put on his finest robes of jade, and set the whole of it alight, and so chose to die in the fire rather than be taken alive. 600 years of the Shang ended between one dawn and one dusk, and the failure who had once turned an entire eager army away from a battle it wanted had now brought down the oldest power in the world in the space of a single morning. Winning the battle was not the same as holding the country, and the early years of the Zhou were dangerous ones, with the conquered Shang lands rising in revolt and the young dynasty nearly tearing itself apart before it found its feet. Through all of it, the old strategist remained what he had been on the field, the steady hand that the kings relied upon. And when the rewards were finally handed out, and the conquered world divided among the men who had won it, Taigong was honored above almost all the rest. He was given a rich territory in the east, out by the sea, a land called Qi, and he became its founding lord. And here the story circles back to where it began, because the old fisherman governed his stretch of seacoast exactly as you might expect a fisherman to govern it. By tradition, he kept the local customs, rather than forcing his own upon the people. He encouraged fishing and salt and trade, and he made Qi prosperous and strong so quickly that it grew into one of the great powers of the age, a state that would endure for some 800 years. The man who had been useless at every ordinary trade turned out to understand, all along, the one trade that matters most of all, which is the governing of men. He lived, the traditions say, to an enormous age, and when he died, he left behind not only a kingdom, but a way of thinking about power that would never again leave Chinese civilization. And then, something began to happen to his memory that happens to very few men. He grew. Century after century, the real strategist swelled into something far larger than a man. To the ages that came after, he was the founder of the whole art of war in China, the teacher every later strategist looked back to. Emperors built temples in his honor and worshipped him as a martial sage, set beside Confucius, the sage of letters, the two of them holding up the military and the civil halves of the world. The Taoists took him up and made him an immortal, a tamer of spirits and demons. And at last, more than 2,000 years after he died, a storyteller of the Ming Dynasty gathered all of those centuries of worship into a single sprawling tale. He seated the old fisherman at the very top of creation and gave him the most godlike power anyone could imagine, the power to hand out godhood itself, to call the souls of the fallen up onto a great scroll and name them, one by one, to their thrones among the gods. That is the very figure the whole world is watching on its screens right now. And underneath all of it, underneath the spells and the thrones and the scroll of names, there was only ever a poor old man who sat on a rock beside a river, and the line in his patient hands had no hook on it all. So we have climbed all the way back down from the top of heaven, from the God who hands out godhood to the old man with the empty line, and we can finally see them clearly, the two ends of a single life. The marvel of Jiang Ziya was never the magic. The marvel is the part that is actually true. A man can fail at everything the ordinary world counts, and grow old with nothing to his name, and still be carrying inside him the one thing his whole age needs, if only he can wait long enough to use it. He was never fishing for fish. He was waiting for the single moment that the impatient men around him could never seize, the moment when one perfectly chosen act would bring down what had looked eternal. The films will tell you that he could command the gods. The truth is stranger, and in its way, far larger. He commanded nothing but his own patience, and with it, he outlasted a dynasty 6 centuries old, laid the foundation of a civilization, and was remembered so long and so deeply that the remembering itself made him a god. And it all began by a quiet river, with a man who refused, year after year, to catch anything less than a whole kingdom for himself.